The morning the wave didn't come was the morning Marcus Steele Alvarez knew something was wrong, because for 2 years, 730 mornings, give or take, the same quiet ritual had happened on the same empty stretch of Maplewood Road, and the old man had never missed a single day. Marcus would come around the bend at exactly 7:15 a.m., the deep rumble of his Harley echoing softly between the rows of maple trees that lined the road like patient sentries, and there, standing beside a weathered white mailbox in front of a small house with peeling paint and crooked porch steps, would be the old man. He never shouted, never stepped into the road. He simply raised one hand slowly, palm out, a small deliberate wave that felt almost ceremonial, as though the two of them were acknowledging something older than the road itself. At first Marcus hadn't thought much about it. The first time he saw the man, he figured it was just some friendly retiree greeting passing traffic, the way older folks sometimes did in quiet towns. But the next morning the man was there again, and the morning after that. Rain dripped from the brim of the man's cap some days. Other mornings frost coated the grass like powdered sugar. Once Marcus even rode through a light snowfall, expecting the road to be empty, but the old man had still been there, bundled in a thick coat, lifting his hand in the same slow wave as flakes drifted down around him. After a few weeks Marcus started lifting 2 fingers from his handlebars in return, the biker's version of a wave, and that silent exchange became their routine. They never spoke. Marcus never even slowed down. But the strange thing was, over time, he began to look for the man without realizing it. As he approached that bend each morning on his commute toward the highway, his eyes would flick automatically toward the mailbox, expecting to see the old figure standing there. And every day, like clockwork, the man would be waiting. Marcus eventually started wondering about him. The house looked old, the paint faded and the front porch sagging slightly toward one side. But it was clean in the way homes sometimes are when someone takes quiet pride in them. A small American flag hung beside the door, its colors slightly worn from the sun. Sometimes Marcus caught glimpses through the window when the curtains were open, old furniture, framed photographs, the faint glow of a lamp in the early morning darkness. But the man himself remained a mystery. Marcus guessed he was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair that stuck out beneath a faded brown cap. He always wore the same denim jacket, no matter the weather, and he always stood in the exact same spot beside the mailbox as though he had chosen it very carefully. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known while riding past at 40 miles an hour, was that inside that quiet little house were dozens of old photographs arranged carefully along the living room walls, and many of them showed motorcycles. Black and white pictures from the 1960s. 2 young men grinning beside chrome bikes under bright summer skies. One of those men was the old man outside by the mailbox, long before the silver hair and slow steps. His name was Walter Dawson, and 55 years earlier he had been a young soldier with a best friend named Danny Rees who rode a motorcycle like it was an extension of his own heartbeat. They had promised each other they would ride across the country when they got home from the war, 2 bikes side by side on endless highways. But Danny never made it home from Vietnam in 1968, and after the funeral Walter had sold his own motorcycle and locked the memories away in boxes he rarely opened. For decades he lived quietly, working construction, raising a family, and eventually retiring to the small house on Maplewood Road after his wife passed away. Life had grown quieter after that, too quiet, sometimes. Then one morning 2 years earlier, Walter had been drinking coffee near the front window when the deep thunder of a motorcycle engine rolled down the road. The sound had hit him like a time machine. He looked up just as Marcus rode past the house. Black helmet, black bike, sunlight glinting off the chrome. Something about it, maybe the way the rider sat upright, maybe the rumble of the engine, had reminded Walter so much of Danny that he found himself stepping outside almost without thinking. The next morning, he waited by the mailbox again. When the biker rode past, Walter raised a hand and gave a small wave. The rider nodded back, barely noticeable. That tiny moment had warmed Walter more than he expected. It felt like the world had suddenly remembered him. So the next day he did it again. And the day after that. Soon the morning wave became part of his routine, something simple that gave his days a quiet structure. Walter never expected the biker to stop or even learn his name. The wave itself was enough. a brief acknowledgement between two strangers connected by the sound of an engine and the memory of a life that once revolved around open roads. And for Marcus, though he never said it out loud, the old man's wave had quietly become part of his own routine too, a small human moment in the middle of otherwise ordinary mornings. Which is why, on a gray Tuesday morning in early October, when Marcus came around the familiar bend at 7:15 and saw the mailbox standing alone with no one beside it, the absence felt strangely loud. He slowed slightly, scanning the yard as he rode past, expecting the old man to step out from the porch at the last second. But the porch was empty. The curtains were drawn. The mailbox leaned the same way it always had, but the figure beside it was gone. Marcus told himself it didn't mean anything. The guy was old. Maybe he overslept. Maybe he had a doctor's appointment. People miss mornings sometimes. Yet as the rumble of his Harley faded down the road and the empty mailbox disappeared in his mirrors, Marcus felt a small knot of unease settle in his chest. Because for 2 years, through rainstorms, cold snaps, and even a light snow, the old man had never once missed that wave. And Marcus had no way of knowing yet that the morning the wave didn't come was the morning that would force him to make a decision he had never planned to make. One that would turn a silent roadside ritual into something neither of them could have imagined. For 4 mornings after the wave disappeared, Marcus tried to convince himself it meant nothing, but each day the silence on Maplewood Road felt heavier than the last. The first morning he slowed slightly as he passed the mailbox, expecting the old man to step out late from behind the porch rail with that familiar slow lift of his hand. But the porch stayed empty. The curtains in the front window were drawn. Marcus kept riding, telling himself the man was probably inside making coffee or simply taking a morning off. By the second morning, he looked toward the house even before reaching the bend, his eyes automatically searching for the denim jacket and the brown cap. Nothing. Just the crooked mailbox and the quiet yard with leaves gathering along the fence line. By the third morning, something in his gut began to tighten. It wasn't logical, after all. He didn't even know the man's name. But routines have a strange way of weaving themselves into a person's life, and the absence of that small wave had begun to feel like a missing note in a familiar song. Marcus rode past again that morning, slower than usual, glancing toward the house long enough to notice something new. A folded newspaper lying on the front step. On the 4th morning, the newspaper was still there, and now there were 2 of them stacked together, their corners damp with dew. Marcus felt that uneasy knot in his chest grow sharper. He tried to shake it off during his ride to work, but the thought followed him all day. The old man had stood outside every morning for 2 years. Rain, snow, summer heat, it hadn't mattered. So why would he suddenly stop now? That night Marcus barely slept. He kept remembering the way the old man waved, slow, steady, deliberate, as if the gesture itself carried meaning. By the time dawn arrived on the 5th morning, Marcus had already made up his mind. As he approached Maplewood Road again at 7:15, the sky pale with early sunlight, he felt his pulse quicken. The bend appeared. The mailbox came into view. And once again, the spot beside it was empty. This time Marcus didn't keep riding. He rolled past the house, went another 100 yards, and then did something he had never done in 2 years of passing that road. He eased the Harley to a stop, turned the handlebars, and circled back. The low growl of the engine echoed across the quiet street as he pulled up beside the driveway. Up close, the house looked older than he had realized when riding past. The white paint had faded to a dull, chalky color, and the wooden steps sagged slightly under their own weight. The small American flag beside the door stirred faintly in the morning breeze. Marcus cut the engine and listened for a moment. The world suddenly felt very quiet without the rumble of the motorcycle. No movement came from inside the house. He walked up the driveway, his boots crunching softly over gravel, and knocked on the front door. "Hello," he called. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, the hollow sound echoing through the wooden frame. Still nothing. That was when he noticed the newspapers more clearly. 4 of them now, stacked against the door like forgotten mail. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He stepped off the porch and walked around the side of the house toward a window where the curtains hung slightly open. Inside, the living room looked dim, lit only by a lamp in the corner that had apparently been left on. Marcus leaned closer to the glass, trying to see past the reflection of the morning sky. At first, nothing seemed unusual. An old couch, a coffee table, photographs hanging along the wall. Then his eyes dropped toward the floor, and his heart skipped a beat. The old man was lying there. Walter Dawson, though Marcus still didn't know his name, was sprawled across the living room rug, one arm stretched awkwardly beside him. For half a second Marcus froze, hoping he was mistaken, hoping the man had simply fallen asleep on the floor somehow. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. Instinct kicked in. Marcus ran back to the front porch and slammed his shoulder against the door. The old wood cracked, but held. He stepped back and kicked it hard near the handle, the lock splintering open with a sharp snap. "Sir," he shouted as he rushed inside. The house smelled faintly of coffee and dust. Walter lay exactly where Marcus had seen him through the window, pale and motionless except for the faintest rise and fall of his chest. Marcus dropped to one knee and pressed 2 fingers against the old man's neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying moment, he felt nothing. Then there it was. Weak, but there. Marcus exhaled sharply and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, dialing emergency services with one hand while keeping the other against Walter's shoulder. "Yeah," he said quickly when the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance on Maplewood Road. Elderly male, possible stroke. He's breathing, but barely." Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the neighborhood. Paramedics rushed inside carrying equipment and quickly assessed the situation while Marcus stepped back, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. One of the medics glanced at him while checking Walter's pulse and said something that made Marcus feel a chill run through his spine. "You found him just in time," the medic said. "Another hour, maybe less, and he wouldn't have made it." Marcus looked down at the old man lying on the floor and thought about the empty space beside the mailbox that morning, the missing wave, the quiet porch, and he realized something that hadn't fully hit him until that moment. If he had ignored that feeling in his gut, if he had simply ridden past the house like he had the last 4 days, the man who had waved to him every morning for 2 years would have died alone on his living room floor. As the paramedics lifted Walter onto the stretcher and carried him toward the waiting ambulance, Marcus followed them out to the driveway, his mind still racing. He still didn't know the man's name. He didn't know anything about his life, his past, or why he stood beside that mailbox every morning. But as the ambulance doors closed and the siren began to rise again, Marcus realized something had changed. Because that quiet little wave had just turned 2 strangers into something more than that. And Marcus had a feeling this wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Walter Dawson woke up in a quiet hospital room 2 days later with the slow awareness of someone returning from a very long sleep, the pale afternoon light spilling through the window beside his bed, and the steady beep of a heart monitor marking the quiet rhythm of time. His head felt heavy, his body weak, but the first clear thought that surfaced through the fog was strangely simple. He had missed the wave. The memory of standing by the mailbox each morning had become so deeply rooted in his routine that even lying there surrounded by hospital equipment, the absence of it felt wrong. A nurse noticed his eyes open and gently stepped closer. "Welcome back, Mr. Dawson," she said with a warm smile. "You gave us quite a scare." Walter blinked slowly, trying to piece together the fragments of memory. The coffee pot, the living room, a sudden dizziness, then nothing. How did I get here?" he asked quietly, his voice dry from disuse. The nurse adjusted his blanket and nodded toward the hallway. "Someone found you and called for help. If he hadn't, things could have ended very differently." Walter frowned slightly, confused, but before he could ask more, the door opened and a tall man stepped inside wearing worn boots and a black riding jacket. For a moment Walter simply stared, his mind catching up with what his eyes were seeing. Then recognition sparked in his tired face. "You turned around," Walter said softly. Marcus Steele Alvarez shifted awkwardly near the foot of the bed, suddenly unsure how to respond. After 2 years of silent waves, hearing the old man speak directly to him felt oddly surreal. "You missed your wave," Marcus replied with a half shrug, as though that explained everything. Walter let out a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "I figured someone might notice eventually." Over the next hour, the 2 men talked for the first time, filling in the quiet gaps that had existed between them for so long. Walter told Marcus about the photographs on his living room wall, about his best friend Danny Reeves, and the motorcycles they used to ride together before Vietnam changed everything. He explained how hearing Marcus's Harley rumble past that first morning 2 years ago had stirred something inside him that he thought had faded away decades earlier. "That sound," Walter said quietly, staring at the hospital ceiling as he spoke. "It reminded me of a promise we never got to keep. Danny and I were supposed to ride across the country when we came home. 2 bikes, coast to coast." Marcus listened without interrupting, his arms folded loosely across his chest. "But he never came back," Walter continued, his voice softer now. "After the funeral, I sold my bike. Didn't ride again. Didn't even think about it much after a while." He turned his head slightly toward Marcus. "Then you came down that road one morning. And I guess I just wanted to wave." The room fell quiet for a moment as Marcus processed that. To him, it had always been a simple gesture from an old neighbor. He hadn't realized it carried half a century of memory behind it. "Well," Marcus finally said, clearing his throat, "you picked the right guy to wave at." Walter smiled faintly, but he had no idea how true that statement was about to become. Because while Walter rested in the hospital recovering from the minor stroke the doctors said he was lucky to survive, Marcus had been busy. The following Sunday morning, Maplewood Road looked nothing like it usually did. The quiet stretch of pavement that normally saw little more than a few passing cars was suddenly lined with motorcycles, dozens of them, their chrome catching the early sunlight like scattered sparks. Riders from Marcus's club had arrived first, but word had spread quickly through nearby towns, and by the time the engines began rumbling to life, there were more than 80 bikes parked along the roadside. Neighbors stepped outside their houses in confusion, drawn by the deep thunder of engines gathering in the morning air. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the same time Walter had waved every day for 2 years, a car slowly pulled into the driveway of the small white house. Marcus stepped out first, then walked around to help Walter carefully out of the passenger seat. The old man moved slowly, still recovering, but when he looked up and saw the line of motorcycles stretching down Maplewood Road in both directions, his jaw dropped in stunned disbelief. "What on earth?" Walter murmured. Marcus reached into the saddlebag of his Harley and pulled out a folded leather vest. It was old but well cared for, the kind bikers wore proudly on long rides. He handed it to Walter without saying anything. Walter turned it over in his hands and saw the patch stitched across the back in bold letters. "Brotherhood never retires." For a moment the old man couldn't speak. His eyes moved from the vest to the rows of riders waiting patiently along the road, helmets tucked under their arms as they watched him with quiet respect. Some of them raised their hands in greeting. Others simply nodded. Walter swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "You're serious?" he asked Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled slightly. "You waved at me every morning for 2 years, he said. Then he gestured toward the dozens of bikes idling along the road. "Figured it was time someone waved back." A moment later the engines roared to life in unison, the sound rolling through the quiet neighborhood like distant thunder. Walter stood beside the mailbox where he had once waited alone each morning, wearing the leather vest now draped carefully over his shoulders, and watched the riders pass slowly down Maplewood Road one by one, each biker lifting a hand in the same steady wave he had given Marcus for so long. Some neighbors wiped their eyes as they watched. Others simply stood in silent amazement at the unexpected show of respect unfolding in front of them. When the last motorcycle rolled past, Marcus remained behind. He rested one hand on the handlebars of his Harley and nodded toward the road. "Tomorrow morning," he said casually, "I'll still be riding by." Walter looked at the mailbox, then back at Marcus, a quiet smile forming beneath the brim of his old brown cap. "Then I guess I'd better be out here waving," he replied. And from that day forward, every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., Walter Dawson stood beside his mailbox again, not just as a man remembering the past, but as someone who had unexpectedly found his way back into the brotherhood he thought he had lost forever.